Post-colonial. Over the past half century, post-colonial literatures and post-colonial studies have gained the attention of more and more readers and scholars throughout the world. Writers as diverse as Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka from Nigeria, Salman Rushdie and Arundhati Roy from India, Derek Walcott from the Caribbean, Seamus Heaney from Ireland, Margaret Atwood from Canada, Patrick White from Australia, and J.M. Coetzee and Nadine Gordimer from South Africa have been prominent when major literary awards such as the Booker Prize or the Nobel Prize have been announced, and their works now appear on numerous school and university syllabuses. Concurrently, their writing has provided the nourishment for a variety of post-colonial theories concerning the nature of such works, approaches to reading them, and their significance for reading and understanding other literary, philosophical, and historical works. Indeed, the production of introductions to post-colonial theory has become a major industry. Post-colonial literary studies owe their origin chiefly, of course, to the enormous and exciting efflorescence of creative writing which first came to the attention of readers and critics in the 1950s and 1960s and coincided with a series of states in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean moving from colonial to post-colonial status. Concurrent with the dismantling of the British Empire came the establishment of the British Commonwealth, a structure grouping together most of the former British colonies. In 1964, Norman Jeffers convened the first Commonwealth Literature Conference at the University of Leeds, and courses in Commonwealth literature became a significant part of the curriculum in English departments at various universities in Britain. Later, such courses would also be introduced in Australia, Canada, India, Sri Lanka, and various African countries, though here the emphasis was more often on the countries' own writers rather than a comparative study or survey, and there was often considerable opposition to the introduction of such courses. The Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes about the absence of any reference to writing by Africans in English departments in Kenya and Uganda, and describes his own struggle to introduce African literature courses at the University of Nairobi. The study of Commonwealth literature in Britain was reinforced by the presence of many writers and academics from the former colonies. Some, like Kamau Braithwaite, V.S. Naipaul, and Wole Soyinka, had come in the 1950s and 60s to study in British universities. Others, such as the novelist George Lamming and the poet Dom Morris, sought work and wider opportunities for publication. After World War II, Britain had recruited thousands of people from the West Indies and Indian subcontinent to sustain the national health and transport systems and to work in the steel and textile factories. As the children of these recruited immigrant workers began to enter the secondary school and university systems in the 1970s, teachers and students alike sought to encourage the study of African, Caribbean, and Indian writing. While Commonwealth literary studies had on the whole striven to remain apolitical, focusing on aspects such as form and style in the novels of Australian authors such as Patrick White, or the use of language in the poetry of Braithwaite and Derek Walcott, sometimes drawing comparisons with works by mainstream British authors, there was also considerable pressure to read and understand these works within a political context. In Britain and the United States, texts by African, Caribbean, and Indian authors were often read within the framework of area studies programs such as African Studies, or Asian studies, or especially in the United States, Black studies or Third World studies. In North America, the civil rights and the Black Power movements, and in Britain, the racist attitudes which kept Black and Asian people out of all but the most poorly paid jobs and resented their presence in British cities and suburbs, led to an increasing emphasis on political, psychological, and cultural resistance to discrimination on grounds of race and color. For authors such as Atby in Nigeria and Braithwaite in West Indies, as for students and teachers of Africa descent in Britain, the Caribbean, and the United States, the writing and reading of texts by African and Caribbean authors were seen as a means of restoring dignity and self-respect to people who had suffered from hundreds of years of contemptuous dismissal, exploitation, and enslavement by the Europeans. Post-colonial literature is concerned above all with the issue of self-representation in two senses of the word, the artistic and the political. Writers from the former colonies wish to speak for themselves, to tell their own stories, including the story of the colonial encounter and its consequences, and so to create the psychological base and historical understanding which will encourage wise choices in self-government. It is the amalgamation of Commonwealth literary studies, Black studies, and Third World studies that has produced contemporary post-colonial literary studies, and which accounts for some of its peculiar features and debates within the discipline. From Commonwealth literary studies, it derives its embrace of a wide range of European settler colonies as well as predominantly indigenous and former slave colonies. The British Commonwealth category also involved an emphasis on English-speaking countries, writing in the English language, and an emphasis on literary texts. Because the Commonwealth was set up in 1948, replacing the political structures and connotations covered by the term British Empire for those ex-colonies which were now self-governing, it excluded former British colonies which had achieved independence and become republics prior to the 1940s, such as Ireland and the United States. However, the influence of the Black Power and Black arts movements in the United States and a combination of Asian and Caribbean radicals in Britain joining forces under the label Black British to contest radical prejudice and discrimination in education, law enforcement, housing and employment, as well as in society as a whole, encouraged an increasing emphasis on issues of identity, racial and cultural difference, and social and economic empowerment, particularly with regard to people of African and Asian descent. In Britain and North America, academics and writers whose origins were in Africa, the Caribbean, the Indian subcontinent, and Palestine became prominent intellectual leaders, elaborating the connections between written discourses and Europe's political domination over the rest of the world. These academics also drew on the thinking of influential European intellectuals such as the philosophers Hélène Cixous, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-Paul Sartre, the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, and the sociologist Michel Foucault. The emphasis these intellectuals have placed on the power of language and modes of discourse has been particularly significant in the development of post-colonial theory. Four names appear again and again as thinkers who have shaped post-colonial theory: Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Of African descent and born in the French former slave colony of Martinique in 1925, Fanon was taught by the great Martinican poet and Marxist politician Aimé Césaire. He studied medicine and psychiatry in France where Lacan was one of his teachers, and published his psychological analysis of racism and its effects, Black Skin, White Mask, in 1952. This is a remarkable personal account and analysis of the effect of the colonial gaze, of being seen, defined, and stereotyped by the Europeans, whose culture is deemed to be superior and to have greater authority than the cultures of Africa and the Caribbean. European appearance and culture is assumed to be the norm by which others are judged, making all others abnormal and either exotic or inferior or both. Frantz Fanon declares that what is often called the black man's soul is the white man's artifact. Thus, Black Skin, White Mask is a psychoanalytical study, an attempt to understand the causes of racism and, more importantly, the effects of racism and colonialism on black people and how to overcome or deal with those effects. In short, Fanon believes that to a greater or lesser extent, black people had internalized the racism of those who ran the society and either accepted an inferior status or felt the necessity to prove themselves fully human and equal, but in the white man's terms. He discusses various ways in which black intellectuals have sought to challenge racist attitudes. One chapter discusses and reluctantly rejects negritude, an ideology dramatized in his poetry by Césaire and developed more extensively in essays and poetry by the Senegalese poet and politician Léopold Senghor. Senghor argued that African culture was completely distinct from but equal and complementary to European culture, drawing on examples from the writings of Harlem Renaissance writers such as Langston Hughes, as well as the cultures of his native Senegal. He claimed that rhythm, emotion, and humor were the distinctive qualities of African writing, that emotion is completely Negro as reason is Greek, and that Africans understood the world through intuitions rather than objective analysis. Senghor and other African intellectuals turned to pre-colonial African cultures and histories to illustrate the achievements of Africans ignored by modern Europeans. They wrote about the significance of Timbuktu as a center of learning in the Middle Ages. Fanon's experience working with Algerians fighting to liberate their country from French colonialism led to the publication of other essay and book, of which The Wretched of the Earth has become the most widely read. In this work, he continues his psychological study of the colonized, but also describes the psychology of the colonizers. He asserts that in order to justify their rule and occupation of the natives' territory, settlers and administrators create and define a Manichaean society. That is, they classify the world of the native as the opposite of everything the European supposedly represents: civilization, morality, cleanliness, law and order, wholesome masculinity. So the native is by definition uncivilized or barbaric, childlike, feminine, unable to rule himself, superstitious. He is deemed to have no historical monuments, no literature, and hence no history. While Fanon had focused mainly on the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized in Africa and the Caribbean, the literary and cultural critic Edward Said, who was born in Palestine, concentrated more on portrayals of Asia, including India and the Middle East. In his influential and much debated book, Orientalism, Said is concerned with the ways in which knowledge is governed and owned by Europeans to reinforce power and to exclude or dismiss the knowledge which natives might claim to have. Drawing on Foucault's work and his notion of systems of discourses controlled by those in power, which define the truths by which we live and judge others. Said refers to anthropology, history, linguistics, and literary criticism, as well as European literary works as a network of discourses which establish a particular view of Orientals as a people to be governed rather than as equals who are capable of self-government. In this case, he argues the writers about the East or the Orient acknowledge monuments, but only those which belong to the distant past. They are ruined monuments, and the cultures are seen as degenerate. Said stresses that Orientalism refers not to a place but to an idea and can be seen as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, having authority over the Orient. Culture and Imperialism, which Said published 15 years after Orientalism, responded in part to another criticism of his earlier work for its non-inclusion of ways in which native writers had responded to Orientalist attitudes and so implicitly represented the Orient and Orientals as silent or silenced subjects. In this work, he not only analyzed the presence of empire in texts such as Jane Austen's Mansfield Park and Rudyard Kipling's Kim, he also referred to writers such as H.B. Fanon, Salman Rushdie, and W.B. Yeats from colonized and post-colonial countries. Whereas Said in his earlier work had focused on academic research and European ownership of the study of the Orient and its problems, Fanon was more interested in the effects on those who have been conquered and how they should resist. In chapter 3 of The Wretched of the Earth, he discusses the various ways in which African and Caribbean intellectuals have responded to European stereotypes, first by internalizing European views of them and their cultures and showing that they can mimic the white man and behave just like him. A second stage comes when these intellectuals, finding that they are discriminated against despite their demonstrably equal intelligence and educational attainment, begin to protest against this discriminatory treatment, often in terms of the very values which the Europeans have proclaimed, especially equality and justice. Fanon believed that restoration of the past was an important factor in giving colonized people the confidence to envision a future without European rule and a nation capable of future achievements. It responded to and negated the European insistence that Africans were incapable of creating a civilization or anything worthwhile. Moreover, the writing of an African or Indian history might involve a different view of events already narrated by British historians. For example, what the British named the Indian Mutiny of 1857 is renamed by some Indian historians as the First War of Independence or the Great Indian Uprising. But Fanon also insisted that the recovery of the past was not enough. In other words, cultural nationalism of this kind was necessary if one was to restore confidence and create a sense of identity. But it was not sufficient if the land occupied by colonizers was to be retrieved and self-government achieved. Writers and intellectuals would need to be aware of current issues, political and economic concerns, and they would need to be in tune with the people as a whole, not just a small intellectual elite. For some writers, this meant an engagement with folk culture, a concern to speak of and for the folk, usually defined as the peasantry or rural population rather than the urban residents. Fanon believed that it was also necessary for writers to propose a political program to show the way towards liberation. This might be seen as one of the tasks Rajarao took on in Kantapura, like Mulkraj Anand previously in The Untouchable and Coolie, and Googie in his later works such as Petals of Blood. There is also a related historical movement with regard to the rewriting of history, which is referred to as subaltern history or subaltern studies. The term subaltern signifies those who are not part of the ruling group, and the subaltern history refers to the history of those groups, those who are subordinated by the dominant class, which is usually the author and the subject of history. Subaltern histories might deal with the groups they dominated, perhaps the working class, perhaps women, perhaps members of a lower caste. The study of subaltern groups has been particularly influenced in India and has played a significant part in the work of another very influential post-colonial scholar, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. She has taken on the difficult task of bringing Marxist, deconstructionist and feminist theory to bear upon her analysis of American, Bengali, British and French texts. Influential essays including Can the Subaltern Speak? Explore the ignored or distorted presence of colonized women in texts such as Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and in official records maintained by British officials in India regarding Sati. A fourth critic and theorist whose name frequently recurs in discussions of post-colonial literary and cultural studies is Homi Bhabha. Drawing on psychoanalytical theory with particular reference to Sigmund Freud and Lacan, Bhabha has elaborated the key concepts of mimicry and hybridity, whereas Fanon and Said have analyzed the oppositions set up in colonialist and anti-colonialist societies. Bhabha has sought to demonstrate that their discourses contain ambivalences and ambiguities. He argues that mimicry of colonizers by colonized subjects can be a form of subversion, since it makes unstable the insistence on difference, which forms the basis of colonialist and nationalist ideologies. Like Said and Spivak, Bhabha celebrates the hybridity of post-colonial cultures, seeing their embrace of European as well as indigenous traditions as a positive advantage which allows their writers and critics to understand and critique the West as both insiders and outsiders. Until recently, it has been the approaches and concepts developed by Said, Spivak and Bhabha that have dominated post-colonial literary theory and criticism. However, their work has been vociferously rejected by the Indian scholar Aijaz Ahmad, who attacks both Said and American academic Frederick Jameson for their homogenizing of Third World writing and their concentration on European and European language texts to the neglect of indigenous language writings in, for example, Arabic, Hindi or Urdu. Ahmad is also fiercely critical of post-structuralism and abstractions, which he sees as a feature of much post-colonial theory, especially the theories elaborated by Bhabha and Spivak. The literary works by H.B., Brathwaite, Rajarao, Rushdie and others can be read as alternative histories which both challenge colonial narratives and give voice to those whose stories have been ignored or overwhelmed by European historians. Many post-colonial texts also implicitly or explicitly engage with and write back to the colonial novels and histories. H.N. uses the term historiographic metafiction to describe novels which include, as part of their structure and allusions, a dialogue with colonial narratives of history. The concept of writing back is central to one of the most influential post-colonial literary studies, The Empire Writes Back, by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths and Helen Tiffin, Three Australian critics who have been leading academics in Commonwealth literary studies. The title of their book refers to Rushdie's comment, "The Empire Writes Back to the Center." What they discuss, among other things, are the issues that arise in post-colonial reading as well as post-colonial writing and rewriting. In autobiographical writings by women in Africa, India and the West Indies, the search for identity and self-fulfillment is even more problematical. One collection of critical and creative writing on colonial and post-colonial women's texts is entitled "A Double Colonization," referring to the oppression of native women by both the colonial and patriarchal local cultures, which confine women to domestic and childbearing duties and discriminate in terms of both gender and ethnicity or color. To sum up, the features of post-colonial are appropriation of colonial languages, meta-narrative, colonialism, colonial discourse, rewriting history, decolonization struggles, nationhood and nationalism, valorization of cultural identity, counter discourse, and challenging stereotypes. Thank you.